How do you think the death of the president in Iran is going to play out or have an impact in this? Also, what are your thoughts? I've heard a few things across the old internet that perhaps, the helicopter.
It's always a good source of information, of reliable, credible information.
Well, I was able to determine that the helicopter did crash. The great debate swirls around whether or not it crashed of its own accord or other national powers and interests perhaps having something to do with it.
Yeah, I saw the same things. The conspiracy that came out immediately. Was it Mossad? Was it the CIA that brought down Raisi's helicopter? And look, the combination of the fact that they were flying an ancient platform. I think Da Vinci himself designed that Bell 212 helicopter, and the weather and the terrain. That area up along there, that northern portion of Iran near the Azerbaijan border is a pretty brutal place regardless. But when you layer in the awful weather that they had, and the age of that asset that they were flying, I'm not buying the conspiracy theories about it was brought down. And in fact, the Iranian regime itself came out over the past 48 hours and said that their preliminary investigations showed no sign of outside interference or attack on the helicopter.
I've been flying airplanes specifically since 2006, and I don't know if it's a good thing or a morbid thing, but I'm always fascinated by incident reports. And more often than not, the aircraft is functioning as designed perfectly while a human being flies it directly into terrain, CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Kobe Bryant died in a modern era helicopter that went from visual flight conditions to instrument flight conditions and impacted terrain. It's almost always human error.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suspect that had something to do with this as well. The quality of the training and experience that the Iranian Air Force has. You would like to think that if they're flying, because it was Raisi, the president, it was the foreign minister, Abdullahian, and it was 4 or 5 others in there, including the regional governor. You would like to think they'd say, let's put them in the finest aircraft that we've got with the best pilots that we've got.
Perhaps it was, Mike.
Perhaps it was, or perhaps it was just the supreme leader deciding to do them in for internal political reasons. Now, if there's a conspiracy, that's the way I would go. I would look at it and think maybe there was something going on internally, and maybe this was the supreme leader saying, "I want to get Raisi out of the way because now that clears the decks for his son to take over as supreme leader," which may well happen, even though they tend not to be sort of dynastic in the way that they view this sort of thing. But I suspect his son is going to step in when the 85-year-old Khamenei goes.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next. They're going to do an election. I think they're calling it a free election. And for those of you just listening, I did the old finger air quotes. I'm just curious, how free do you think that election, what process do you think that they will use, regardless of what they position it to the outside world? Mm-hmm. And what kind of person do you think will get to fill that role? More open, more of a hardliner, or kind of just status quo?
Well, I think they'll look. Raisi was president, and he became president, and the election was mocked by a portion of the Iranian population. A lot of corruption, fraud within the election. He wasn't a very popular individual. He was a brutal guy. And the reason why he was president and had Khamenei's support while he was alive was because he was pretty much a toady for Khamenei. He was for the supreme leader. He was a brutal character, right? So it was a little odd to see the U.S., the deputy ambassador to the UN, stand up in deference during a moment of silence in the UN Security Council to the death of Raisi. I'm thinking, have some balls and sit your ass in the chair, because this is not a person you would want to be celebrating. He was responsible for the death of thousands and thousands of Iranians. So the Iranians themselves, aside from the mullahs and the politicians and the military leaders, the IRGC, the people that had to show sadness over Raisi's death, the rest of the population was like, nah, we're not closing the shops, business as usual. And very depressing in the sense that they all basically said it won't matter. He dies, they'll just choose another hardliner. He'll come in, he'll take office, he'll be in charge for 4 years. Probably during that period of time, Khamenei will either die or step down. And so they'll bring in, because unlike here in the US, where apparently, you can have politicians live into their hundreds. I think the next president in this not so free and fair election will be equally a supporter of Khamenei and the hard line. Nothing's going to change. I think the best gauge of that is the Iranian population themselves, and they're very cynical about the idea that there could be some change.
Do they host elections in Iran, or will they position it as an election where this person was actually elected, or are they just going to skip those steps?
No, it'll be an election supposedly. Again, I'm doing the finger quotes too.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it'll be but it'll be postured as an election, and much with Raisi, there'll be people who will say, look, there's nothing free and fair about this. It's about as free and fair as Putin's last re-election, the other week, in which he won, I think, something like almost 90% of the vote.
Great turnout. Spectacular numbers.
It's fantastic numbers. Yeah. So, but hey, I mean, look, again, it's one of those things where people, I think, when Raisi, died, I think people were like, well, now we got to think about what this means for Iran. It doesn't mean, as long as the mullahs are in charge, as long as there's a supreme leader who oversees really anything important in that country, you're not going to get any change there, and therefore you're not going to get any change in terms of longer term stability or peace or opportunities for peace in that Middle East region. Certainly not related to Israel. Right? Iran's been very clear over the years. They want the destruction of Israel. They want to remove Israel. Talk about genocide. Look, they're the ones guilty of genocide. They actually want to erase another group. Right?
Yeah.
The Israelis, the IDF, is going after Hamas, a terrorist organization. They're not trying to erase the Palestinian people, much as campus protesters would like to cry about. That's not they're going after Hamas, terrorists, right? They're trying to improve their security. They're not erasing them. Technically, when you talk about genocide, it's one group trying to erase another group from the face of the earth. That's what Iran and their proxies, Hamas and the others, want to do with Israel. So if there's a reason to throw out the term genocide, it would be on that side, because they've been very clear and stated in writing and in speeches that's what they want to do. I don't want to get mixed up in wordsmithing here, but I'm always fascinated when gormless teenagers protesting on campus just buy into this ridiculous narrative spread by students for Palestinian justice, or the various groups that are out there influencing these things. Boy, I disappeared down a rabbit hole, didn't I?
I mean, they're all around us. They're all around us. I'm sure we'll find some more. I hope we find some more. Does the shift in president, does it change your concerns at all, or think maybe perhaps people in the government from a nuclear perspective with Iran?
No, I think because, again, that's a matter for the supreme leader.
Yeah.
So you've got consistency there. And look, the IRGC is over the years has become more and more and more important. Right. And so there is a possibility, if there's going to be any change in how sort of the leadership structure exists in Iran, it could be the IRGC playing more of a role in putting a person in place as the president. But I don't think that's time yet. I could see a day when the IRGC basically controls everything, because they certainly have their fingers in any major part of the economy, and they've been enriching themselves for decades in that manner. But for now, I think they'll just get on with an election. They'll put a toady in there who's loyal to Khamenei, and they'll continue along the way. The nuclear issue is massively serious, because for years they've been working their way towards that. Even though people like to think, well, if the previous administration hadn't dumped the nuclear agreement that we had, that Obama put in place in 2015, but that's not the case. They were still marching their way towards a weaponized nuclear, capability. And so I don't think that's going to change. They're very close to, breakout at this point. And that goes hand in hand with their ballistic missile technology and capability and improvement in that area. So I think that's a problem. And it's a problem in part because, and we also see that with the Saudis, and the Saudis trying to, going along with the U.S. effort to ink a deal between the U.S. and the Saudis. And part of that is the U.S. would then help the Saudis with their civilian nuclear program. Well, that in part is because the Saudis are thinking, look, if the Iranians break out and say suddenly we've got the bomb, the Saudis are going to be right behind them. They're not going to allow Iran to have that without the Saudis having that capability.
Do you think those two would ever launch against each other if they both had capability?
Yeah, great question. Never say never. Could you have a regional flare up like that? I think it's probably more than a flare up. It's probably more than a flare up, isn't it? They start launching nukes.
I was going to say that's a Jacob ladder straight to hell right there. It's like, well, they launched one, so we have to launch one, and maybe we just burn the Earth to toast.
Yeah,